The United States is preparing what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent calls an unprecedented new round of economic pressure on Iran. Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the U.S. Navy can maintain its blockade of Iranian ports indefinitely by rotating ships in and out of the region. But this brings us to a question. What added pressures can Washington deploy that have not been already used? Since 2018, the U.S. has added around 2,200 sanctions on Iran, including roughly 350 under the current economic fury campaign. The sanctions have severely constrained Iran's economy, and the naval blockade pushed the oil exports to a multi-year low. But despite years of sanctions, Iran has so far resisted any pressure or altered its position on the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has instead adapted to years of sanctions through alternative trade channels and sanctions evasion networks. The economic pressure is closely tied to the Strait of Hormuz, through which around 1/5 of global oil and LNG supplies traveled before the war. Shipping traffic has collapsed from roughly 130 to 140 vessels a day before the conflict to just 8 vessels this week. Iran has used control over the waterway as leverage, demanding sanctions relief and the release of frozen assets before commercial shipping can fully resume. The disruption is also hitting global energy markets, with the IEA now forecasting a 4.3 million barrel a day decline in global oil supply this year. That leaves the U.S. with several options, and each carries a bigger political cost. Washington could target more Chinese refineries, banks, and companies involved in buying Iranian oil. China accounts for roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, making Beijing central to any attempt to cut Iran's revenue. The U.S. could also target exchange houses and financial intermediaries that help Iran convert oil payments into usable foreign currency. But sanctions on major Chinese financial institutions could open a new front with Beijing. The U.S.-China tech war has already spilled across drones, semiconductors, and even food brands. And there's a domestic political calculation, too. Trump is under pressure to bring fuel prices down while the November midterms are approaching. And that leaves the U.S. facing a difficult calculation. More sanctions could deepen Iran's economic pain, but there is no guarantee that they will translate into political concessions. Now, the strategy is therefore a high-stakes gamble. Washington is betting that sustained economic isolation and the Hormuz blockade can achieve what years of sanctions and military pressure have not. But any targeting pressure tactic could trigger an even bigger oil shock or a wider confrontation with China. All right, to discuss this further, from London, we are now being joined by Mike Buckley, a senior journalist and political commentator. Thank you so much for taking out your time and joining us on the broadcast.
Great to be with you.
Now, let me just begin by asking you, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said on Thursday that the United States is going to apply measures that have never been seen on Iran. According to you, what could be this never-been-seen measures?
There's very little more that the US can do. I mean, as you've been saying, and as we've all seen over the last, it's been decades now that the US has been imposing sanctions on Iran. It hasn't just been since February. So as you were saying earlier on, the Iranian regime has got incredibly used to functioning under very extreme sanctions, and sanctions that indeed are incredibly unusual in the world, because the US has been so opposed to the Iranian regime, I mean, really since the end of the 1970s. But of course, the sanctions have got progressively more stringent as time has gone on, and have already been increased this year. So in one way, I think it's important for us to see what's coming from the US, and what we see coming from the US regularly, I mean almost daily, it is a different statement about how they want to put further pressure on Iran to do what the US wants them to do, which is to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and to go back to the status quo as it was before the war was started by the US and by Israel in February, which of course Iran has refused to do, and they've put their own set of requirements on what a peace deal should look like, including the full withdrawal of the US from the region, the withdrawal of the US naval blockade at the end of the Strait of Hormuz, and the end to any hostilities in Lebanon, and to further help for people, other people in the Middle East, like the people of Gaza and the West Bank as well, which of course the US is refusing to do. So we're essentially at stalemate. So I think today's or the recent announcements from Scott Bessent are largely seen in that context of a US that is desperate to bring this war to a close, in part because of its domestic constraints, because of the coming midterm elections, but also because of its frustration at the fact that it started this war, itself created this crisis, and it cannot end it. It can't end it through military means. It tried to do that, but the Iranian regime did not fall. And indeed, they imposed the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, which is causing so much problem for the US economy, but also for the global economy. But also because the US is increasingly looking powerless. However, there are some further things that the US can do, primarily aimed at other countries. So other countries, for example, China or India or other countries who still buy, for example, crude oil from Iran or otherwise trade with Iran, that the US can put pressure on those countries not to do so. But it's very unlikely that China, for example, will comply. The US may have more success with other countries. But as we've seen repeatedly with Iran, both in terms of physical goods trade, including oil, and also financial means as well. For example, using cryptocurrencies, Iran is very, very good at finding ways around US sanctions. So whatever the US does, it seems likely that the US regime will find a way around. But what this is all but certain not to do is put enough pressure on Iran that they cave into US demands.
That's interesting you pointed out China because as you mentioned in the report, that could be a way, but already U.S.-China relations don't really look good, especially in the tech war. In this point, what realistically can U.S. actually do against Iran, or this is just a forever war to you?
It cannot be a forever war. It's in nobody's interest for this to be a forever war. Iran, it does at some point need this war to end. It will want the Strait of Hormuz to open. It will want the gas and the LNG to flow. It won't want this to get to a point, for example, where a big pipeline is built across Saudi Arabia, and there are other means for this LNG or oil or gas to travel. And Iran does need to get money and relief for its own economy. And I would imagine it has the ability to survive this for many, many more months to come if it has to. But I think Iran does want to see this come to an end. And the US will want to see this come to an end. I would imagine a realistic end point is the end of the Trump administration if we don't see an end to this before then. But I certainly hope that we see an end to this before then. But it's very difficult to see what that will look like because both the US and Iran are very, very dug in. However, I mean, one thing that could happen, we've all lived with Donald Trump as president of the United States, both in his first administration and particularly in this administration, and we've seen him get very obsessed with things and then get bored and moved on. I mean, Greenland is one example. At the beginning of this year, he was talking about invading Greenland and taking Greenland away from Denmark. And he's mentioned it a few times since, but mostly he's moved on to other things. But the Iran war, though, is of a different magnitude because it's a real war, not a hypothetical war. And what he doesn't want to look like to his own population or indeed to the world is a loser. And if he caves in and walks away, which is probably the only way out of this, he will, of course, look like a loser.
Oh, that being said, when we talk about the Trump administration, War Secretary Pete Hegseth has said that U.S. Navy can maintain the blockade indefinitely. What would determine how long this blockade actually continues? Because what we're hearing right now is, of course, people are exhausted, soldiers are exhausted in these carriers that exist there. There are plumbing issues. There are reports of these soldiers trying to commit suicide. At this point of time, what is realistically, and how do you agree with the statement coming from Pete Hegseth of this indefinite term that he's used for this blockade?
Well, I was saddened and horrified to hear the reports coming out of the U.S. Navy and the servicemen and women who've been serving on there, some of them for, I think, up to 250 days, and the difficulties, understandably, they're suffering. But horrified also to hear Pete Hegseth dismiss those claims and those news stories out of hand and say that it's you know, I think he was saying it was fake news, which of course we know that it isn't. And of course people are going to be finding it stressful. So that does need to be dealt with. But that is one, you know, away from the individuals involved. That's a very real thing. It is very real that servicemen and women cannot go for long periods or extended periods without some kind of short leave and R&R. So there is a simple human component of people have limits. There is also the fact that this is costing the US, billions and billions of dollars. That is not sustainable in the long term. And there's also the military cost and the hardware cost. We know that one of the things that China, for example, is watching, Russia is watching, other nations are watching, is the fact that US stocks of important missiles and interceptors and so on have been incredibly depleted by the Iran war. And this is one of the reasons why the US cannot just continue its military bombardment, because it will run out of stocks of its own most important weaponry. That would, of course, leave it exposed, and it would also make the world a more dangerous place. For example, it may embolden Russia to do more in Ukraine or more in Europe as well. And none of us want to see that.
On the other hand, we also have Vice President J.D. Vance. He's come out with a statement saying that the President Trump's immediate priority regarding the war with Iran is to lower oil and gas prices, and this is ahead of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. He's mentioned that clearly. Now, of course, when it comes to gas prices, it's a big issue when it comes to Trump, considering, as he also mentioned earlier, the midterm elections. If the gas prices do remain high because of the Iran conflict, can Trump realistically expect Republicans to hold the Congress in midterms?
Well, all the news I see and all the polling that I see seems to say that the Democrats are very likely to take the House of Representatives, the lower house. Be much more difficult for them to take the Senate. So we will have to wait and see. And there were, of course, I think after the primary result in Wisconsin this week, there were also questions now over the viability of the polling industry in the US. Although the big caveat with that is that it's much more difficult to poll a primary election than it is an actual election where all the electors and all the voters are involved. But the way the polls are going, it looks like the Democrats will take control of the House. That will make things more difficult for Donald Trump. If the Democrats also took control of the Senate, they will be able to severely restrict Donald Trump's ability to do what he wanted to do and his government for the next 2 years. So anybody who's opposed to what Donald Trump is doing in the world, whether in the US or whether in Iran or anywhere else, will be watching those polls and hoping for a certain kind of result, no doubt.
Could that possibly push Trump to listen to Iran and actually agree to the terms and conditions that they would want Trump to agree upon?
It's possible, but it's difficult to say, because one of the things that has been true to this point in US history really is that the vast majority or all US presidents have operated with a certain set of rules and boundaries. When they fit a certain blockage, for example, opposition from the Senate or from Congress, they have backed down. Donald Trump has proven to be, for the most part, unwilling to do that, although on occasion he has. So, for example, when the Supreme Court ruled earlier this year that his tariffs were unlawful, he has been issuing, or his government has been issuing refunds to the companies that paid those tariffs. And we're talking about billions of dollars. I was reading earlier today that I think Apple just got a rebate of $2.2 billion. So there have been times when he has kind of played within the lanes and within democratic norms. So assuming that the House goes to the Democrats, and if the Senate does as well, and if he does face opposition, and if he does have Congress overall therefore saying, no, you cannot do this and you must do that, it will be interesting to see how he behaves. Does he comply, or does he continue to push the boundaries and break the rules? And that, of course, will bring into question the potential need for change in the way that the US runs its democracy.
And where do you think, or what kind of role do you think Israel will play at this point? Because, of course, we have Hegseth and Scott Bessent saying they have maybe, I don't know, a trump card, perhaps. But how would you see Israel's reaction to that if at all it doesn't work out? And if Trump actually goes and agrees with Iran, if at all there is no solution he finds to pressure Iran to listen to him?
Trump, as far as we can tell, does not seem very interested in the views of Netanyahu or of the Israeli government, and he doesn't seem particularly concerned with the impact on Israeli politics or indeed the impact on Israel as a whole. It's very hard to read, but the impression that comes out is that the US administration and Trump are angry at Netanyahu in particular, but also Israel more broadly, for the fact that they persuaded Donald Trump to go into this war in February, arguing that it would be easy, like the very short war in Venezuela, or the takeover of Venezuela right at the beginning of the year, that the Iranian regime would fall and that they would be able to install a compliant government that would allow them to do whatever they wanted to do. That, of course, didn't happen. And it was patently obvious to anybody with any understanding of Iran and its history and its strength, indeed, as a country, that wouldn't happen. And certainly since the spring, the late spring, the US has moved on from any pretense that it's working in alliance with Israel. The initial deal that it did with Iran was done over the top of Israel's head with no Israeli involvement whatsoever. And that, of course, angered Netanyahu and the Israeli government. And I think that situation will continue. What the US has not done, of course, is completely rein in Israeli activity in Gaza or the West Bank or Lebanon. And of course, that is something that is one of the key requirements of Iran. So on the one hand, the US is still allowing Israel to do what it wants to do in Lebanon and its immediate neighbors, including Gaza and the West Bank. What it is not doing is talking to Israel about the end of the war in Iran. But what is this is doing, of course, is further isolating Israel because the US is really its only ally now, but it is also further isolating the US because it is now really just the US versus Iran, with the rest of the world watching on and hoping this comes to an end sooner rather than later.
Right, there's more to discuss and speculate, but we'll have to wait for at least Scott Bessent's never been seen measure before we take this further. We'd like to have you again to discuss that further. Thank you so much, Mike Buckley. Thank you so much for joining us and giving your perspective. I appreciate it.